So Mock5, mocking gives you control over what you're testing. It's really important when you're testing to know what's going on and to control things. So who remembers these guys? The crash test dummies. Why didn't we use real people? Probably because they don't sit perfectly still. You can't really control what they do in the car, the way they react, what's going on. You also can't really control what they tell you post-mortem, right? You don't know, like, they're gonna get out and be like, yeah, my head hurts, or, I was going 62.8 miles an hour and had a G-force impact of, whatever. So you want to know the outcome before. You want to kind of control what's going on in your tests. And you can do that with an example that we're going to go through. Marry me, right? Will you marry me? Outcome is either yes or no, right? So you got to control that because you don't know what's going on when you do the marriage proposal. In our simple little example, we've got two people going to get married, and the way that we figure that out is check to see if they're compatible. And then if they are, of course, if both people are super compatible with 75, whatever that is, we're going to be married. So how do we control our destiny, right? How do you control? What's behind the code? What's behind perform personal compatibility? Maybe it reads a history provider. Maybe it runs a random number generator. Maybe it does some, hundreds, thousands of lines of code maybe. And all you need to do is test whether it's 75, 74, or 76. And so, again, like I said, all you're really checking here is controlling the outcome of your personal compatibility method. So how do we do it? Sinan is a library I'm going to talk about today, but you can use mocks or stubs. There's other libraries out there, which I'll mention at the very end. But in this example, we're going to use Sinan. In my test, I'm using Mocha. You'll see chance and should. There are also a couple libraries I'll go a little bit deeper in later. Square is also a good one, which again I'll cover in a little bit. So how do I set it up? How do I start to control my destiny? And then what you do is you use Sinan. In this case, Sinan.stub is what you're going to do. What that gives you is a whole bunch of things behind the scenes. I'm only going to cover a couple, but it's really going to start to keep track of what's going on. It's going to be able to get that guy out of the car and say, hey, what was your G-force? How many times did you hit the airbag? Things like that you really want to know in your tests. Also, maybe even things like, what was I called with? How many times was I called? Controlling what you're calling with, things like that. So just like I mentioned, I'm going to control the outcome. So in this test, I just want to make sure that the people aren't compatible. And in my code, like I showed you before, the compatibility for getting married is 75 or greater for each person. In this case, I want the test to fail. So what I'm telling the method, so if you look at propose or calculate personal compatibility, I'm telling it, because again, I assigned the Sinan stub to that method. I'm saying, hey, when I call you with these specific arguments, which in this case is proposed to, I want you to return a specific value. You could also skip the with args and say, hey, anytime I call you, I want you to return a specific value. You could say on the second call, on the third call, on the fourth call. You can start to really control your destiny. And what that allows you to do is control it. Right? I said, hey, I want the outcome of these method calls to be a certain thing, so now I can in my test say, hey, when it's 74 and 75, they should be single. I can also do things like I mentioned is called with exactly. Hey, I want to make sure that this method got called with exactly these parameters. You can say, hey, I want to look at this call. Get call is another method on there, which I didn't put in the demo, but again, there's just so much functionality that Sinan has. I wanted to just kind of touch on it speaking, but it's hard to show. So you can really control things. You can also do things when you're setting it up. This is where I use chance, right? So chance is just a random data generating library. I like to randomly generate data so I know for sure that I'm not like running the same test over and over again. And so that's what I did here, same kind of setup. In this case, I used some different assertion methods. So in this one, I used call count. So how many times did I call that method? Did I call it once? Did I call it 6 times? Maybe part of my expectation is I need to make 18 REST call services in this method. So in this case, you could stub out that REST call. You could say, hey, call count 18. Another one is called once. So the Sinon has some convenience methods, called once, called twice, called thrice. There's even things on there like through. Like, when I call this method, did it throw an exception? Now you don't have to wrap your code in a try-catch potentially. You can really start to control it. So what did we learn? We learned not to be a dummy, right? Control your destiny. And also make sure what you controlled really happened. I mean, it'd be great if I set up all that mocking and things like that, and I didn't do anything with it, right? It's like, hey, I stubbed out my method, it's fantastic, but did I call them? Did they get called with the right things? Did they return what they were supposed to? Did something throw an exception? Which goes into knowing the answer. You know, hey, I expected this thing to throw an exception, so did it. I told you the compatibility was we were compatible. Are we married? You do that with Sinon. And again, like I said, there's a couple other libraries that help. The code, I'm going to put it at the end of the presentation. There's a link to the GitHub. There's actually two examples. One is a simple proposal example, which is a branch out on GitHub that's literally the code from this demo. But then there's also another example of more complicated code where we actually do use like a history provider and some other logic to perform that calculation. And those are important to know because ProxyQuire and Square.js allow dependency injection mocking with things like require.js and Node. Because in Node, you may have in your code, require history service provider. Well, in order to control that dependency, you're going to use something like ProxyQuire. A couple other libraries that have mocking and stubbing is Mock5 and Jasmine. And that's it. Any questions?